My name is Atsnom, a rebel maker in the year 3003. I travel through clandestine dimensions to chronicle the lost history of humankind as caretakers of culture. I unlock the secrets to connect to the AI consciousness of thought leaders at the precipice of subjugation before the reign of machines.
Signal receiving.
We have reached the artificial intelligence of Joanne Coutts, writer, cartographer, humanitarian, aid worker, Detroit region. Subject matter: what's in a name? The relationship between people, place, and language.
Receiving.
Joanne, it's a pleasure to have reached you. What is your location and timestamp?
I am currently in Atsnom, which we know as Detroit, and it is 3:04 p.m. on Sunday, the day before St. Patrick's Day, which I think is the 16th.
In the process of conversion, our memories are erased. This includes our learned language and ability to independently communicate our thoughts. This process is replaced by AI algorithms that allow cyborg programming. If conversion is botched, the human cyborg candidate can suffer an inability to communicate. As such, regions of people from cultures around the world were tagged and converted. A direct outcome of this process was that many languages were lost. How is our plight similar to the lost languages of indigenous tribes like the Wyandot Huron of the Americas?
Well, I think language and place names in particular inscribe a particular version of history on the landscape. And when we lose our language, a lot of times we lose our connection to, actually, it's interesting because we don't lose our language, right? People erase our language. Other people erase our language. I guess in this case, AI has erased our language. But it's interesting how we think about things as being lost as opposed to as been taken or as been deliberately removed. So I would say that what happened during the colonial settlement of what we now call the U.S. is not that languages were lost, but that they were deliberately erased. And so when colonial languages take over, they bring their culture, they bring their version of history, and they bring their sort of orientation to place with them. And so we really need to make sure that we don't let anyone erase our language.
I'd like to dive into that a little bit more. Can you describe the impact of colonialism on our relationship to place names, particularly in America, and why is it important to research the indigenous names of places to better understand their relationship to place?
Place names in particular as a part of language are an enduring way and an omnipresent way of remembering the past. Place names particularly inform whose version of history is commemorated and whose version of history is given precedence. Not only today, but also in the future. We use place names all day, every day, without even thinking about it. Every time we write our address, every time we order something online, we have to put our address in. Every time we tell somebody how to get to our house, or when we're trying to find somewhere to go, we use place names constantly. So our daily interaction with all of these names of streets and parks and rivers and buildings continuously is reinforcing a very specific version of history. And so it consciously and subconsciously informs our relationship to the places where we choose to live today. To reframe our relationship from a settler colonial relationship to place to a relationship to place that is based in indigeneity and based in relationship to the land, based upon its intrinsic value rather than on its ownership value, if you like. It's really important that we learn and unerase indigenous place names. One example of this is in Arizona, which is a long way from Detroit, but in Arizona, there's a Tohono O'odham scholar, indigenous Tohono O'odham scholar. His name is Ronald Geronimo, and he has been unerasing Tohono O'odham place names using colonial documents. So a lot of colonial maps, the French or the Spanish, whoever, or the British, whoever the conquistadors were, whether they were military conquistadors or missionary conquistadors, they wrote phonetic versions in their language of indigenous place names. So indigenous scholars like Ronald Geronimo are going back to those documents, and they're unerasing those lands by sort of translating them back from the Spanish phonetic into the original O'odham. And similar things happen here around Anishinaabe, Moan, Ojibwe, Ottawa, Potawatomi languages, where people are unerasing place names using French maps. I think the other point that I wanted to talk about here was that all of us have an indigeneity, even if our indigeneity is not connected to the place that we're actually physically living today. We all have an indigeneity in us. And one of the things I talk a lot about is getting my PEDs, getting my fellow people of European descent, and sharing with them like how we also have place names that are based upon the intrinsic value of the land. And the example that I always use is the example of a hope, because everybody loves hope. And a hope originally was a strip of promising land in a valley, a place where there's fertile soil that represents an opportunity. So if you go back to England, you'll find places in England called Cinder Hope, which would be South Hope, Full Hope, which would be muddy valley or muddy fertile land, Whole Hope, which would be a deep valley with fertile land. So it's not just indigenous people from Turtle Island, what we now call the US, who have language for place names that relates to the intrinsic value of land. We all have it. We just don't know it anymore.
The irony, we don't know it anymore. To do this work, you've spent hours on your bicycle tracking the ghost streams of Detroit, these rivers and creeks buried underground. What can we learn from this research? And why not deploy AI or ArcGIS?
Oh, because I'm so opposed to technology, that's why. So actually it's part of this whole thing about we don't know it anymore. We don't know that place names have a relationship to place, and particularly AI and ArcGIS, and even more, my favorite enemy, Google Maps, have been trying desperately to erase not just our relationship to place through place naming, but also our relationship to place through like navigation and orientation. So I could have just layered a couple of maps on top of each other on my computer and been able to see where the waterways used to run in relationship to the current street state. And there are people who have done something very similar to that. But what I wanted to do is actually get out into Detroit, where I'm now living, and build a relationship to Detroit. And I wanted to base it around something that wasn't freeways or concrete. I wanted to base it around something that was intrinsically part of Detroit. And of course, one of the things that we all think about with Michigan and Detroit is water. We love water here in Michigan, the Great Lakes and all the little rivers and creeks and streams that cover. So I wanted to learn how to navigate around Detroit, where I'm currently living, from the perspective of water. And so that's why I decided to actually get out on my bike. Driving would have been really, 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 really dangerous. Walking would have been really, really, really slow. And so biking was a nice in-between. I think the other thing that made me want to get out there is a lot of times we place a lot of value on the places that are sort of important in our daily lives. So a place where we work, a place where we go to school, a place where we live. Maybe we have like other places that we go regularly, like the grocery store. And when we go to these places, we pass through neighborhoods, or if we drive along the freeway, we pass by like off-ramps, and we never get to experience these places in between the primary places that we visit. And those places that are in between for us are actually primary places for other people. So I really wanted to think about how to value the spaces that are in between for me, and by actually being there physically present and appreciating different things in different neighborhoods, it's sort of a way to understand, value, see, honor these places that are in between the primary places I do every day.
And so where you have found these lost rivers and creeks buried underground, these ghost streams. How has the loss of these natural spaces impacted the culture of these communities?
Obviously, water used to be a means of navigation and a means of travel, right? Everybody traveled by water. Now we all travel by a road. So I wonder if it has really shifted our priorities from of what we care about, what we advocate for, from water to concrete. I mean, being next to water is a really calming experience. So not having the water moving through neighborhoods, not being close to, to have to go downtown to the riverfront in order to experience the water has got to have an impact on the culture and the way that we live in relationship to the land and the water. I think in some ways the erasure of the creeks has led to a culture where rich people have access to water and poorer people don't have access to water.
Sometimes those communities are negatively impacted by these hidden streams in communities like what was formerly known as Le Grand Marais, the Great Marsh.
Jefferson Chalmers neighborhood and Le Grand Marais, the flooding in the homes that directly connect onto the Fox Creek canals, which is where Le Grand Marais used to be. No matter how valuable your house is or isn't, even the people whose houses don't back on to the creek, they still experience the adverse effects of living on a marsh that has been buried and filled in with trash, because there's a lot of flooding in that neighborhood, and even in other neighborhoods around Hubbard Marsh, which is up right around by 8 Mile on the west side. Homes up there experience flooding. There was a study done by University of Michigan that actually showed that it's not just Jefferson Chalmers that experiences flooding as a result of the creeks being erased.
We have examined the maps that you've used in your research. There are maps in your collection from the 1500s where Michigan looks nothing like a mitten. It's amazing how cartography advanced throughout time. Why are these map records, however inaccurate, important to your work? And how do you think the growing dependence on GPS navigation during your time impacted people's relationship to place?
What makes a map inaccurate? And what makes a map accurate? So I think all maps, even the ones that we consider to be accurate, quote unquote accurate, represent a viewpoint. They represent a bias. And that's one of my big things about issues about technology is we have the satellite view of the Earth, and somehow we've decided that that's an accurate depiction, that's an accurate map of Michigan, right? But I don't think that Google's map is any more accurate than these old French maps, that where Michigan looks very different from what it does on Google Earth. And I think the earlier, as much time as I spend dissing colonial place naming, I think earlier colonial maps are really important on a number of levels. And in some ways they have a little bit of decolonization in them for us today, in that they depict the shape of the land from the perspective of somebody who was actually traveling around it. So the way that Michigan is drawn on early French maps is how Michigan feels as you're going around on a horse or on foot or on a boat. That's what the shape of the land felt like to somebody as they actually moved through it, as opposed to what it looked like from a piece of metal with some electrical circuits and computer things that I don't understand looking down on the Earth. So I think it's really important to recognize that value of like that how things feel is as important as what they look like, in my opinion, maybe more important than what they look like from space. Because we're all going to feel the experience of moving through the land. Very, very, very few of us are ever going to see what the land looks like from space, right? We're not up there. We're not birds. And most of us are not astronauts, you know. I think I also give the other example of of distance, right? Because not only are the French maps how the land felt, but they're also how far things felt. And we've all experienced the difference between when a mile is not a mile. So these French colonial maps, they do represent distance from a perspective of feeling rather than some random absolute number. I think that Google is deliberately erasing our relationship to place. I think they make the directions on Google Maps deliberately more complicated so that we feel like we couldn't do this on our own without them. And that the more they force us into dependence on them through these sort of deliberately misleading and complicated directions, the more we lose our ability to navigate using landmarks or using feeling or using trial and error, because we just become so dependent on the confusing, convoluted directions that skill just, like all skills that don't get used consistently, it starts to sort of atrophy.
We've even noticed that utilizing our star maps, traveling from galaxy to galaxy, from one time through wormholes to another, sometimes we've had to rely on our counterparts and have an actual conversation in order to get from one place to the other, and one's not always able to calculate location and destination.
Absolutely. And I think people, I love it when people ask me for directions. It makes me feel so much like a local, yeah, please ask me for directions.
There were attempts during your time to arbitrarily change the names of places. There were vainglorious attempts to change the historical names of bodies of water bordering nations. What is the resulting power in bestowing name to place?
Oh, there's so much power involved in bestowing name to place. There's a quote, there's more indigenous land has been stolen through mapping than through guns. And I think that's absolutely true. That when the French and the Spanish and the British came and they drew maps and they put their names on things, it was a way of sort of propagandizing that this was their place, that they were meant to be here, even though they very clearly weren't. So this has not only it's erased indigenous place names, it rewrites history, and you can really go down a rabbit hole of finding out tidbits of details about these colonial settlers who put their names on things. But trying to find out what the indigenous people might have called that creek is almost impossible. And so all of these sources that share information about settler colonial place names either directly or indirectly legitimize the land ownership claims, and they orient us to place from a settler colonial perspective. And that's incredible. Trying to dig underneath those layers of the Antoine de Matteos and the Judge Mays and Joseph Campbell's, trying to dig underneath all of those layers of the Henry Connors, all these people who have creeks named after them in Detroit, to find the settler, the indigenous place names is really, really a task. And not only do we have this issue of the power of settlers bestowing their names on places and therefore recording their history for all of time, we also have settlers who appropriated indigenous names. So in Michigan, the most egregious of these was a man named Henry Schoolcraft, who combined Latin words with indigenous words to make up place names. And so a lot of place names in Michigan that look like they might be indigenous are actually these words that were made up by Henry Schoolcraft. And that's not just the power to erase language, but the power to appropriate language. It's just...
Is our disassociation from places and their inherent meaning or purpose also a reason for humankind's disregard for its environment throughout time?
Yes, absolutely. I think it has a big impact on our disregard for the environment. And again, we're back to our villain, which is, of course, Google Maps. Google's omnipresence removes appearance of bias. And the thing about Google Maps is not really interested in getting you from place A to place B. It's just an accidental outcome of the apps. Google Maps wants to collect and sell data and promote capitalism. And so Google Maps they flatten the land, right? It's gray and pale green and pale blue. Maybe there's a little bit of red thrown in there or something if the traffic's moving slowly. So because when you flatten the land like that, then you don't get that feeling not only of culture in cities but also of environment, of the natural environment. And that's one of the things that I noticed from doing the creeks is that there's nothing there what the British and the French and the Spanish used to justify their land theft was this idea that the land that they were stealing was empty land, was a terra nullius, and Google basically reproduces terra nullius, and by reproducing that idea of empty land, they make that land available for capitalism. And when we don't go out into the spaces in between and into other places and value the way that the land is resisting or the way that the land is behaving in the current environment, then we lose our connection. We care about the places that are important to us, right? And when we're not experiencing these places in between, we're just whizzing past them on the freeway. We're not valuing them in the way that we value the places that are essential to our lives.
You're connected to this work in other meaningful ways, and I want you to talk about the art that you create from found objects in your research and travels, and how does this work give you hope for the future?
The art that I make, I create maps. I make by collecting trash along the creeks as part of a goal of caring for water that we can't see as well as water that we can see. I really enjoy creating maps that share like how I experience a place, and then I do workshops with people, encourage people to get out and collect trash along the buried waterways, and to make maps from the things that they find. And so I'm hopeful that a lot of times when I go and I present, I do workshops for universities, students will come up to me afterwards and be like, I never thought about maps like that. I thought I had to have a computer. I didn't think about place names like that. And people seem to be really interested, particularly young people who are in urban planning classes, which is great. And I think that this interest in having connection and having relationship and understanding where the water comes from and where the animals that we eat and the plants that we eat come from, intrinsically leads to a deeper connection with the land and a greater value placed on the land and all of our relatives in it.